Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 11 of our History of International Politics lectures, we will have a look today at the evolution of international society since the end of the Cold War. An evolution synonymous with the triumph of a solidarist type of international society, a restrictive international society, as opposed to the pluralist international society that prevailed throughout the Cold War. This solidarist international society is based on values rather than interests, on common values, and more specifically on some common values, that is to say, basically on liberal values, the values, the norms, the principles of the Western world in general, and of the US more specifically. The Western world calls itself international community. It claims to represent the international community, and as such, of course, distinguishes itself from the so-called rogue actors, rogue states, or more generally speaking, rogue actors. This return of solidarist, a type of international society, is possible, has been possible thanks to America's victory in the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, I would like to quote Stephen Walt in his latest book, The Hell of Good Intentions. At the end of the Cold War, the US achieved, I quote, a position of primacy unseen since the Roman Empire. Materially, the US has been dominating. We saw this when analyzing the unipolar system of the post-Cold War world in our first part. And regarding the non-material dimension, of course, the end of the Cold War was synonymous with the decline, maybe the definitive decline of communist values put forward by the USSR, of the third world or anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist values too put forward by a significant part of third world countries. And of course, liberal values triumphed, and I would say specific liberal values, or a version of liberalism focusing, emphasizing progress rather than tolerance, that is to say, the progress towards a kind of end of history. We'll come back to this, considering liberal democracies to be the only legitimate political regime, and therefore claiming the right to spread, sometimes forcefully, these democratic values upon non-democratic or illiberal units, which means also, of course, that this kind of liberalism emphasizes the right to interfere as opposed to the non-interference principle. To put it differently, since the end of the Cold War, the Western states, and the US more specifically, have the possibility, they have the capacity and the possibility to do what the Soviets prevented them from doing during the Cold War, because of, or thanks to, the Soviet communist values, and also somehow the Soviet military strength. That is to say, the Americans now, since the end of the Cold War, can imagine that they are able to expand to the whole world the liberal order that they had established among Western liberal countries in the aftermath of World War II and throughout the Cold War. So a new type of international society based on Western values and called international community. Admittedly, ladies and gentlemen, the formal expansion of the international society went on after the end of the Cold War. Legally speaking, no condition was put to those states that emerged, notably due to the breakup of the Soviet Union. The 15th successor states of the USSR were admitted automatically as legitimate members of the United Nations. The same is true for the 6 or 7 successor states of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the Czech Republic and Slovakia also after their so-called velvet divorce were admitted at the United Nations, and the same is true for the two units that became independent in Africa, South Sudan and Eritrea, after its war of secession or independence against Ethiopia. So legally speaking, formally speaking, no obstacle, no legal condition, no political condition was put to these new states. They were recognized as members of the United Nations, embodying the contemporary international society. Substantively, however, I feel free to say that liberal democracy, human rights, and free market economy became what Jack Donnelly calls the new standard of civilization. The new standard of civilization, in allusion to the standard of civilization of the 19th century that we saw last week, the new standard of civilization of the so-called international community. I say so-called international community. Why? Because I consider this term to be an ideological notion and not an academic or scientific concept. International society is a scientific concept. It aims at describing and explaining what is going on in the non-material dimension of the international order. But international community is a rhetorical device. I quote John Mearsheimer in his latest book, The Great Illusion. It is a rhetorical device that powerful states use, in our case, first and foremost Western states, to sound high-minded when they actually are pursuing their specific national interests. That is to say, it is an ideological expression used to disguise power political practices in some kind of moral or ethical clothes. To give you an idea of this new standard of civilization, let's have a look at what happened to the charter of the Organization of African Unity when it became the African Union. The Organization of African Unity was created during the Cold War, immediately after the independence of the majority of African states around 1916. And the African Union, and it was transformed, it was turned into the African Union at the beginning of the 21st century in 2002. Throughout the Cold War, anti-imperialist and Pan-African values were prevailing. This is no longer true since the end of the Cold War, at least since the very beginning of the 21st century. Let's look at the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, established in 1965. This is what it says. The Charter proclaims the right of all people to control their own destiny. This is the non-interference, the anti-colonial non-interference principle. The Charter underlines its willingness, the willingness of the member states, I quote, to safeguard and consolidate their hard-won independence, as well as the sovereignty and territorial integrity, to fight against neo-colonialism in all its forms. And the Charter also emphasized its determination to favor a larger unity, the Pan-African unity, transcending national and ethnic differences. These were the values that were prevailing in the Third World, and more specifically in Africa, throughout the Cold War, immediately after the decolonization episode. If then we look at the Charter of the African Union, adopted in 2002, we immediately see the difference. This charter claims that its objective is to promote and protect human rights and people's rights. So no longer the people's right to be independent, but also human rights. It claims that its objective is to promote, to consolidate democratic institutions and culture, and to ensure good governance and the rule of law. No more anti-colonialism, no more emphasis on maintaining independence, on rejecting interference, but proclaiming the will of the African states to ensure good governance and the rule of law. This example is significant, and another example is all the more so significant, the European Union. After the end of the Cold War, a lot of, and to some extent, almost all former popular democracies of the Eastern or the Soviet bloc, the Eastern and Central European states that were controlled by the USSR and governed by communist regimes, were eager to join the European Union, also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, of course. But before being admitted, what did they have to do? They had to submit to the so-called Copenhagen criteria, because they were adopted by the European Union during a summit in the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, in 2003. Listen to the definition of these criteria. Membership requires that candidate country, the Eastern European countries, membership requires that these countries have achieved stability of institutions, guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, respect and protection for minorities, the existence of a functioning market economy, as well as the capacity to cope with competitive pressure and market forces within the European Union. Membership presupposes, the last sentence, the candidate's ability to take on the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union. So the expansion, the geographical expansion of the European Union, of what we may call a regional international or European society, in order to integrate the Eastern European states that had been excluded because of their communist past during the Cold War, this expansion was a top-down process. The new members had to accept the rules of the European Union in order to be admitted. Beyond these concrete illustrations, ladies and gentlemen, there has been existing since the end of the Cold War a kind of general doctrinal or ideological tendency to reintroduce a normative hierarchy among states that are, legally speaking, equal sovereigns, but that politically are not equal. A hierarchy, to put it differently, a distinction, a line between insiders of the international community, that is to say, those states that share the model of liberal democracy on the one hand, and outsiders, all other states, all other political entities. The first to emphasize this distinction was, even before the Cold War came to an end, during the summer of 1989, so 3 months before the Berlin Wall came down. The first one was Francis Fukuyama in his End of History, with a question mark. This was his article, the original article, the book, The End of History, and The Last Man was published 3 years later. There is no more question mark in the title. In this End of History thesis or scenario, Fukuyama claims that the world is divided into 2 parts. The post-historic world, which is composed by liberal democracies, by economically developed democracies who no longer resort to war, to violence in their mutual interactions. They form a zone of peace, to put it differently. And on the other hand, there is a still historical world composed by autocratic, illiberal states, economically underdeveloped, or at least less developed, and they are still at war among one another, and they are torn apart by civil wars, by violent conflicts, be they of nationalist, ethnical, religious nature, or of political, ideological nature. And following Fukuyama, many experts, pundits, even some academics, and all the more so think tanks, proposed more or less the same analysis, dividing the world into different zones or into different kind of peoples or states. The criterion used to distinguish them being the existence or not of liberal democracy. So, for instance, the American Freedom House, which is both an NGO, a non-governmental organization, a think tank, a pressure group. It is financed by the American administration. Freedom House divides the world among three types of states: free states, partly free states, and non-free states. Roughly 40 to 45 states nowadays are considered to be free. 1/3 are considered to be partly free, and a quarter or so of the existing 193 states are considered to be non-free. Another example, Farid Zakaria. I quoted Farid Zakaria in my first part, his a book, which actually was his PhD dissertation, From Wealth to Power, when he analyzed the rise of America and the imperial understratch that characterized America before it became a world power. He chose to become an expert rather than an academic. And as an editor of Foreign Affairs, he also published in this magazine an article called The Rise of Illiberal Democracy. Illiberal democracy to be distinguished, according to him, from liberal democracies. What is the difference between the two? Basically, the difference is the following one. Democracies are political regimes whose government are elected by the majority of citizens in free elections, during free elections. Liberal democracies also are characterized by the fact that the governments, that the elected governments do respect the rights of the minority and adopt policies that aim at satisfying the interests, somehow private interests of the majority of the individuals living in the state. Illiberal democracies then are democracies whose government indeed are elected by a majority of citizens, but who do not respect the rights of significant minorities of various kinds. And Farid Zakaria is alluding to notably those illiberal democracies, according to his analysis, that prevail in former Eastern Europe, in Russia, in former Yugoslavia, etc., whose governments are elected by the majority of citizens, but these governments do not respect minority rights. Max Singer and Aaron Wildavsky, two American professors of political science of international relations, proposed an analysis of what they call the real world order, divided into zones of peace as opposed to zones of turmoil. It's pretty close to Fukuyama's distinction. I would also like to mention Robert Cooper, an advisor of Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister during the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century. He, after being a counselor of Tony Blair, he became an advisor of the European Commission. He wrote the book, The Breaking of Nations. And in this book, he distinguished three types of states: postmodern states. He was thinking of the members of the European Union; modern states, that is, states such as China, Russia, to some extent even the US, who still go on resorting to violence; and then pre-modern states, that is to say, roughly all the former third world states, the former colonies that had become independent during the 60s. And last but not least, John Rawls. John Rawls is one of the maybe top 5 or top 10 political theorists, philosophers of the 20th century. He's famous for his theory of justice, published at the beginning of the 1970s. And at the end of the 90s, he published The Law of Peoples, where he applies his theory to international politics, international relations, no more to domestic societies, as was the case in his theory of justice. The law of peoples, ladies and gentlemen, not the law of nations, in order to emphasize the distinction that his proposal, the distinction between his proposal and the positively existing law among nations, or law of nations, that is to say, international law of peoples. And in this book, he goes as far as distinguishing 5 types of peoples. Liberals pretty often have the tendency to distinguish the peoples from their rulers. The rulers, when they are autocratic, have to be distinguished from their peoples. The peoples, to some extent, are not guilty of their rulers' behavior. The 5 types of entities that he distinguishes are the following one: reasonable, liberal peoples, decent, hierarchical peoples, benevolent absolutisms, outlaw states, and burdened societies. Outlaw states, not outlaw peoples, because in these states it is the autocratic leader who's an outlaw, not the people in the state itself. So reasonable, liberal peoples, decent, hierarchical ones, benevolent absolutisms, outlaw states, and burdened societies, we may call them underdeveloped societies. And he went as far even as imagining a kind of decent, hierarchical, Islamic people that he called Kazakhstan, to be distinguished from the somehow really existing Islamic or Muslim states. So a tendency to once again draw a line between us and them, between the liberal democratic members of the so-called international communities and all the other units. These discourses, ladies and gentlemen, these conceptions, these visions, as in the past, were put into practice by the Western governments, by the Western powers, and more specifically by the United States, eager to impose what Mearsheimer and Walt call the liberal hegemony. The liberal hegemony, that is to say, they adopt a liberal foreign policy, a foreign policy based on liberal premises in order to diffuse their values. Ladies and gentlemen, you may remember that in my last chapter, I quoted Mearsheimer, according to whom liberal states, when they are confronted to other major powers, to non-liberal major powers, these liberal powers speak or talk like liberals, but act like realists. Logically, then, when there is no more major competitor, when there is no more major rival, they can afford to adopt a liberal foreign policy, not merely to talk liberal, but also to act liberal, like liberals. That is to say, they can afford to try to spread, sometimes forcefully, liberal values. Listen to John Mearsheimer's analysis, page 122, 124 of his The Great Illusion, The Great Delusion, The Great Illusion, is a book by Norman Angell at the eve of World War I, where he put forward his idea of peace through economic interdependence. So I guess that this book by Mearsheimer is an allusion to the great illusion, and he calls this a great delusion. It is a mistake to believe that it is possible to spread liberal values successfully. So listen to Mearsheimer: as long as the states operate in either a bipolarity or multipolarity, they have no choice but to act according to a realist logic. This is what the US did throughout the Cold War when dealing with the USSR. We saw this in chapter 10. Circumstances, I quote again, arise where the balance of power is so favorable to a liberal state that it can pursue a liberal hegemony. Sometimes there are favorable circumstances in the balance of power, maybe, or actually, Mearsheimer should have used the term imbalance of power, because if the balance of power is favorable, it's no longer a balance. By definition, it is an imbalance. But Mearsheimer is an adherent of the balance of power theory. I guess this explains why he goes on maintaining this, keeping this expression. Third part of the quote, this situation, an imbalance, is likely to occur in unipolarity, which is defined as the presence of only one great power in the system. When there is only one great power in the system, then there is no great power competition. And therefore, the prevailing power no longer has to practice a realist foreign policy. And fourth part of the quote, the last one, the United States found itself in the position, in this unipolar position, when the Cold War ended and when the Soviet Union collapsed. And unsurprisingly, it embraced liberal hegemony. The US, thanks to its unipolar preeminence, could afford to adopt a liberal foreign policy. Here again, John Mearsheimer somehow contradicts himself. 30 years ago, he predicted the return of multipolarity, but he now acknowledges that unipolarity prevailed after the end of the Cold War. Anyway, according to him, the US adopted unsurprisingly a liberal foreign policy. Why unsurprisingly? Because of what he calls the crusader mentality, which characterizes Western liberal democracies or major powers, and first and foremost the United States. This crusader mentality is due to the political liberal philosophy or doctrine or ideology, which characterizes Western states. A liberal state, first of all, considers that the basic individual of politics in general, and therefore of international relations also, the basic actor is the individual, not the state. And within this assumption, there is a second dimension. The core point within this assumption consists in saying that all individuals, wherever they are living, have the same basic rights. Very concretely, this has a consequence. Liberal states are tempted to protect the basic rights of individuals living in other countries when these basic rights are massively violated. Second characteristic of a liberal state, according to the liberal philosophy, a liberal state does significant domestic social engineering in order to promote within its borders in favor of its own citizens, in order to promote and to protect their rights and their interests. When then a state intervenes because it is tempted to do so in another state in order to protect or to promote the massively violated basic human rights of the populations in this other state, then this social engineering ends up in state building operations. That is to say, the liberal state, after intervening, undertakes state building operations in order to somehow stabilize the situation, permitting therefore the populations in the countries concerned to benefit from basic human rights. And last point of this liberal philosophy, which prevails in liberal states posit that liberalism is the best political philosophy. It considers itself to be superior. Liberal states consider themselves to be superior to non-liberal states, which ends up in the belief that state building operations are not too costly, are likely to be successful, are manageable. And concretely, this means that state operations are likely to last pretty long without being put into question in the case of them not being that successful as expected at the very beginning. This political ideology, ladies and gentlemen, according to John Mearsheimer, and also according to Stephen Walt, is held and therefore diffused, spread by the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy elite in the Western powers. Liberal hegemony, according to Stephen Walt, I quote, is a full employment policy of the foreign policy elite. The foreign policy elite is defined, I quote, as the set of individuals and organizations that actively engage on a regular basis with issues of international affairs and who seek, not merely are they interested in international politics, of course, they try to do what? They seek to shape public perceptions, and even they seek to influence government policy directly. This is what Stephen Walt calls the blob in Washington. The blob is a term coined by Ben Rhodes, an advisor of Barack Obama. It's kind of pejorative. The term, of course, the blob is the set of think tanks, of NGOs, of lobbies and advocacy groups and consulting groups and media, and also some academics turned experts whose aim is to analyze international political issues and to propose and to diffuse their recommendations. These networks, according to Walt, and Mearsheimer shares the same analysis, are characterized by a kind of activist bias. All the more so, this permits them to make a lot of money, of course, but more seriously, they also believe somehow spontaneously, somehow genuinely, somehow sincerely, that to spread liberal values is essential both for US security and for the benefits of the whole world. They also believe that it is easy to do so, and since they are not held accountable to some extent, nobody is likely to oppose their recommendation, to reject their recommendations when the practice does not live up to the expectations. These beliefs, ladies and gentlemen, diffused by this foreign policy establishment, are of course shared by the policymakers themselves, and in this case by the American policymakers. Listen to George Herbert Bush, the father, the winner of the Cold War, the winner also of the Iraq War, the Gulf War, that is to say, Operation Desert Storm against Iraq in 1991. This war, which permitted to forget the American defeat in Vietnam, and therefore to exorcise the ghosts of the Vietnam defeat. Listen to George Herbert Bush, who believed in a new world order, possible thanks to what? Thanks to America, I quote, standing alone at the height of power, and therefore having the opportunity, the rarest opportunity to shape the world, and who had the deepest responsibility to do so wisely for the benefit of the US, but also of all nations. When America acts, all the nations profit. This is the typical contemporary version of the manifest destiny. America is exceptional, and its manifest destiny is to make sure that everybody profits from American values. Listen to Madeleine Albright, one of Bill Clinton's secretaries of state in the 1990s. She considered the US to be the indispensable nation that sees farther than the others do. So the US shows the way that the others should imitate in order to know freedom and progress. Listen to George Bush Jr., George Walker Bush, the son, who launched American troops against the Taliban in 2001 and against Saddam Hussein in 2003. It is the policy of the US to seek and to support the growth of democratic movements and institutions with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world. Our aim is to put an end to dictatorships in order to permit democracy to prevail. America's influence, fortunately for the oppressed, is considerable, and we will use it confidently in freedom's cause. So it is America's duty to spread its value. Concretely, what did this vision end up in? It ended up in distinguishing two types of political units, two types of political entities within which Western states had the rights and the duty to interfere. Not in all of them, of course, but in a significant number of them. These two types of entities are the following ones. The first refer to those who were called burdened societies by John Rawls in his Law of Peoples. The burdened societies are the states which will be called by experts, etc., I'll come back to this, quasi-states, failed states, sometimes collapsed states, shadow states, weak states, or fragile states. And the second category concerns are those called outlaw states by John Rawls. Outlaw states will be called rogue states or weapon states, or states of concern by the American administration. Let's have a look at the details of these two kinds of states, or non-states to some extent, and how the Western liberal powers dealt with them. Failed states. Let's start with the failed states. With failed states, as indicated by the label used, failed states are not, strictly speaking, genuine states, not modern states in the meaning of Max Weber. That is to say, characterized by the monopoly of legitimate violence. All the less so are they welfare states, of course, that is to say, likely to protect a minimum of welfare of their own citizens. They are political units whose authorities are unable to work efficiently for the benefit of their own populations. The term failed states, and the same is true for all the other ones, collapsed, fragile, shadow, weak states, etc., were invented gradually in the 1990s after a first term had been coined, quasi-states, a term proposed by the Canadian scholar Robert Jackson, whose objective was, I think, basically academic or scientific or theoretical. That is to say, Robert Jackson wanted to emphasize the fact that international relations as a discipline, mainstream international relations, was wrong when considering that third world states, notably, were states in the strict or substantive definition of the term. Why? Because in the third world, a majority of states were unable to maintain domestic order and to provide social and economic welfare to the majority of the population. So his aim was to make international relations scholars aware that they should not use the same conception of states when dealing with Western or Northern powers on the one hand, and when dealing with actors of the third world on the other hand. This academic aim was then transformed into a problem-solving objective by experts and consultants who came to the conclusion, if these states are quasi-states, and I will call them fragile states, weak states, shadow states, collapsed states, failed states, then we, Westerners, who know what the real genuine state is consisting in, we Western states and we Western non-government organizations have a right and even a duty to show to these states what to do in order to become genuine states. Western powers, Western liberal states and Western liberal non-governmental organizations have the right and the duty to interfere in the domestic affairs of these quasi-states in order for them to become quasi-states, normal states, genuine states. It's exactly the same argument that had been put forward by John Stuart Mill. Remember the quote I gave you last week. There is a difference to be made in the domain of interference, depending on the level of civilization, or here the level of development of the states concerned. This interference then took place through peace-building operations, peace being in the broad meaning of the term. I'll come back to this, and through state-building operations. Peace-building first. I would like you to know, ladies and gentlemen, that the different terms that are used do not have exactly the same meaning. You have to distinguish peace building, peace keeping, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, and peace enforcement. Peacekeeping, strictly speaking, to keep peace, meant operations, thanks to which blue helmets, UN helmets, were sent in a zone of war to separate the belligerents. This occurred, for instance, in 1947 between Pakistan and India when they became independent and when a war started between the two. This happened in the Near East between Israel and Egypt. In Cyprus, when the northern part of Cyprus became independent with Turkey's support. Peacekeeping. So only the belligerents are separated thanks to the presence of UN troops, national troops acting on behalf of a UN resolution. Peacemaking consists for blue berets, no longer blue helmets, no longer troops, but civilian actors, to contribute to establish some kind of trust between belligerents, to re-establish the dialogue in order to get out of the logic of enmity, of hostility. This took place in various civil wars, Guatemala, El Salvador, Namibia, Cambodia, etc. Mozambique, Sierra Leone. And then peace-building operations is a step further. That is to say, blue berets and non-governmental organizations remain in the states torn by civil war in order to organize elections which should permit the new majority, the new government, the new authority to be recognized as legitimate by all the belligerents. These three peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace-building operations do respect the sovereignty of the state or the states concerned. The blue helmets and the blue berets are sent with the authorization of the governments concerned. Things are different in the case of peace enforcement, as the label tends to indicate. Peace is enforced against, if necessary, the will of the government concerned. And such a peace enforcement, of course, occurred in order to put an end to various violent situations in those states whose governments were considered as being guilty of massive violations of human rights. That is to say, peace enforcement operations were undertaken against rogue states, and I thus come to the second category of our others. Rogue states are those states that are accused of violating adequate norms of behavior, appropriate principles of behavior, either on the international scene or in their own domestic political scene. On the international scene by doing what? By threatening their neighbors, and sometimes by attacking them, by being eager to acquire weapons of mass destruction, if not by possessing weapons of mass destruction, that is to say atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, and or accused of sponsoring or harboring terrorist networks. Rogue states are also accused of violating massively in their own territories basic fundamental rights, basic fundamental human rights of their own population, either the population in general or some ethnic or religious or national minority in particular. The term rogue state was invented by American administrations. Here again, the evolution of the linguistic evolution is very significant. When I was a student in the 1980s, and during the Cold War, the then majority of the United Nations General Assembly was a third world majority in terms of sheer numbers. And the majority of somehow left-wing regimes of the third world use the term pariah state. Pariah state to do what? To designate four states they considered, they were eager to stigmatize, because these four states were anything but sympathetic to left-wing third world countries. The four states concerned were Israel, South Africa, South Korea, and Taiwan. Why? Because they were accused, South Korea and Taiwan, to prevent North Korea and continental China from unifying Korea and China under a communist regime. They accused Israel from denying the Palestinians the right to have their own independent state. And they accused South Africa of violating massively the basic rights of the black majority because of the apartheid regime. This concept, or should I say, this term, this ideological term, of course, this expression was abandoned at the end of the Cold War, when the third world anti-imperialist, somehow socialist values declined. And the new term that emerged was coined by the new normative majority of Western liberal states, in this case, the US more specifically, or American administrations, rogue states. Rogue states reminds us the term brigand states that had been used in the 1930s during the interwar period in order to distinguish the peace-loving nations, the so-called orderly democracies, to quote Wilson, from the brigand states, the brigand powers, designating fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and totalitarian Soviet Union. So these rogue states, these outlaw states, these states of concern, these weapon states are our liberal democracies, others. They are our behavioral barbarians because of what they do, and sometimes even our ontological barbarians because of what they are. By definition, they are anything but liberal democracies. So these states are, in the case of states, because they are also rogue actors, of course, the terrorist networks. These states are formally admitted as members of the United Nations, embodying the international society, but they are excluded from the international community, which the Western powers claim to constitute. They are therefore what we may call barbarians from within the international society. And this is the reason why, when we deal with these states, part of what George W. Bush called the axis of evil, we cannot apply the rules that prevail in relations among liberal democracies who live in a zone of peace, in a zone of democratic peace. Listen to Robert Cooper. I come back to Robert Cooper. He published a short article beyond his book, The Breaking of Nations, called Why, very significantly, Why We Still Need Empires. Why we still need empires. Listen to Cooper. The post-modern world, that is to say, the European Union, the US too, the US is all at once postmodern and modern. Postmodern because of its values, modern because of its capacity to use strength, military strength, which is not the case of the European Union, which has no unitary defense, of course. The postmodern world has to get used to double standards. Among ourselves, among democracies, among liberal democracies, we operate on the basis of law and open collective security, cooperative security. But when dealing with old-fashioned states outside the postmodern continent of Europe, and this is typical, old-fashioned, that is to say, there is a kind, once again, of theological conception of history. History moves towards an end. Some people are still old-fashioned because they did not reach our level of development, of freedom, of civilization. When dealing with old-fashioned states beyond postmodern Europe, we need to go back to the rougher methods of an earlier era, to force, to preemptive attack. He used the term preemptive, but he means preventive. Remember the distinction we made 2 or 3 chapters ago. We need to go back to whatever is necessary to deal with those who still live in the 19th century. Pre-modern states nowadays still live in the pre-modern world, in the 19th century. So we cannot deal with our laws of the 21st century or the 20th century. The 19th century world of every state for itself, the state of war. Among ourselves, listen to this, we keep the law, but when we are operating in the jungle, we must use the laws of the jungle. The laws of the jungle when dealing with old-fashioned states that still go on living in the 19th century. The same recommendation is given by John Rawls in his The Law of Peoples. He establishes a kind of comparison between contemporary outlaw states and what Aztecs did when the Spaniards landed at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifices, and therefore the Spaniards had the right to put an end to them. The same is true according to Rawls. For Western liberal democracies intervening in those states that massively violate basic human rights. These outlaw states, these rogue states, I quote, must be made to realize that without honoring human rights, their participation in a system of social cooperation is simply impossible. I could say their participation in the international society or the international community. So therefore, and this is his conclusion, military intervention might be called for. We might need to use military force if human rights violations become shocking. Rawls' recommendations, Robert Cooper's recommendations were put into practice. They were put into practice by Western major powers, by Western liberal powers, the US and its allies, first and foremost the French and the British, in Yugoslavia, in 1995, in Bosnia, in 1999, in Kosovo, against Milosevic's regime. The recommendations were put into practice in 2003 by George W. Bush in his Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein. They were put into practice in 2011 against Gaddafi in Libya. And they have been put into practice and still somehow are put into practice in Syria since 2014 against Assad, but also against the Islamic State. Things are a bit different regarding the intervention in Afghanistan 2001 against the Taliban because of the terrorist attack of 9/11 that had taken place. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden were harbored, protected by the Taliban regime. These operations, these military interventions, these wars were decided, some on a unilateral basis, that is to say, without UN or UN resolution. This is the case for Kosovo, and this is the case for Iraq. 2003 other ones were adopted, legally speaking, in accordance with the UN Charter. This is the case of Bosnia 95 and of Libya 2011. But whatever these specific differences, I do consider that these operations are representative of an updated version of the traditionally solidarist international society. And as such, it is an updated version of the international community, is the updated version of the past Christianity, of the past European Commonwealth, of the past civilization, when dealing with pagans, with savages, with non-civilized entities. Of course, these rogue states are weak, militarily speaking. The Western powers run no risk when undertaking their military interventions. There is no risk of any kind of retaliation. The powers concerned are third, fourth, even fifth-rate powers. Listen to Colin Powell, the chairman of the chiefs of staff of the American Army, before becoming Secretary of State under George Bush the son. This is what he said in 1991. I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of enemies. I'm down to Castro and Kim Il-sung. Easy to defeat. These military operations that were called Allied force in Bosnia, deliberate force in Kosovo, enduring freedom in Afghanistan, Iraqi freedom in Iraq, Odyssey Dawn in Libya, and Inherent Resolve in Syria 2014, these operations were justified, of course, just as in the past, the conversion to Christianity, the introduction of private property, the spread of civilization were the justifications put forward by Western powers. Contemporary justifications are the following ones. We have to intervene because of what? Because of the duty to interfere. This is what the French doctor Bernard Kouchner proposed as early as in the 1970s and the 1980s. A duty to interfere as opposed, of course, to the non-interference principle. We have to interfere in order to favor human security. Human security is more important than national security because it permits to save the life of individuals. Military operations are necessary in order to protect people. The responsibility to protect was adopted in 2005 by a UN resolution. There are some differences between these terms, these justifications, the duty to interfere, human security, responsibility to protect, but basically they refer to one and the same idea. The fact that a state sovereignty, the norm adopted in 1648, enshrined by the UN Charter in its preamble, in its Article 2, we saw this last week, a state's sovereignty is less important than a state's responsibility, that is to say, towards its citizens, which means that the individual's sovereignty is more important than the state's sovereignty. And this idea was summed up by the then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan. Listen to him. States are now widely understood to be instruments at the service of their people and not vice versa. States should serve their people. And he distinguished the state sovereignty from the individual sovereignty. The individual sovereignty is superior to the state sovereignty. This statement by Kofi Annan perfectly sums up the new zeitgeist, the new mood, the neoliberal mood at the origin of the interpretation of international norms. When we look at the UN Charter, what do we see? We see that human rights indeed are explicitly mentioned. They were mentioned in 1945 when the Charter was adopted. Listen to the preamble. It proclaims its faith in fundamental human rights. In fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small. In its Article 1, the UN Charter stipulates that the achievement of international cooperation in solving institutional problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, to solve these problems is one of the purposes of the United Nations. To promote and to encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms is another objective. So the UN Charter, yes, explicitly mentions human rights, but throughout the Cold War, these excerpts of the Charter were forgotten. They were neglected. Why? Because of the then prevailing mood, which was favorable given the decolonization period, given the somehow incredible success of communist values after World War II. These excerpts were forgotten because of the preeminence acknowledged to the non-interference principle, the right to be independent, the right of the new states to do what they wanted and not to be told by former colonial powers what to do in their domestic regime. And logically then, since the end of the Cold War, because of the decline of these third world or left-wing or socialist values and perceptions, human rights were rediscovered and they are no longer neglected. There is nowadays, to quote Samuel Moyn in his book, The Last Utopia, there is a kind of cult of human rights. And they both evoke hope. Every individual has the right to benefit from fundamental human rights. They evoke hope and they provoke action. They provoke action because Western powers came to the conclusion the non-interference principle permits some, and this is true, autocratic dictatorship regimes in the South, permits these regimes to massively violate the rights of their own populations. So we should put an end to the strict respect of the non-interference principle. We should have the right to interfere when there are massive violations of human rights. And thus, a very significant number of military interventions occurred since the end of the Cold War. These wars, ladies and gentlemen, which are called operations, humanitarian interventions, are constitutive, if you accept my analysis, of the so-called dark side of democratic wars. The expression is due to German scholars, notably Anna Geiss. Democratic wars looking at the dark side of democratic peace. They are constitutive, these wars, of what the American author, former officer in the US Navy, Jonathan Cavalli, calls democratic militarism. In the past, we saw this. The fact for European members of the then European International Society to recognize each other as equal had as a concrete consequence of the wars that they fought against each other were limited, with the exception of the Hobbesian and the Nazi period. The Western powers waged limited wars against each other on the basis of their mutual recognition, on the basis also of just war tradition. But when dealing with the outside world, they fought illimited wars of conquest and of conversion. And the same is true nowadays. There is a zone of peace, of democratic peace. Democracies do not go to war against each other. This is the so-called democratic peace theory. But they use violent means when dealing with illiberal units that do not, that are not part of this zone or of the international community. This democratic violence has been growing throughout, I would say, the 25 first years of the post-Cold War world. Jonathan Cavalli shows in his book that democracies were committed during the Cold War During the Cold War, democracies, Western liberal democracies were engaged, involved in 15% of the then interstate wars, 15%. During the first decade of the post-Cold War world, this percentage reached 24%. One war out of four was concerning Western liberal democracies. And during the second decade, 2000 to 2010, Western liberal democracies were involved in 43% of the wars that broke out during the first decade of the 21st century. Here we have a list of the wars concerned, waged directly by Western liberal democracies since the end of the Cold War. If we go beyond wars strictly defined, war strictly defined in quantitative terms, provokes the death of at least 1,000 battle-related victims. This distinguishes wars from quarrels or disputes, minor violent conflicts. So if we go beyond wars strictly defined in quantitative terms, America intervened since the end of the Cold War six times more often. It resorted to violence 6 times more often during the last 30 years than during the 200 first years of its existence, 1776 to the end of the Cold War. An analysis or an inquiry made by a congressional report, that is to say, a research financed by the US Congress. The name of the report, updated last September 8, is the following one: instances of use of United States armed forces abroad, 6 times more often in 30 years than during the 200 previous years. To put it differently, since the end of the Cold War, and it is a term used also by John Mearsheimer, since the end of the Cold War, Western liberal democracies are committed in a kind of perpetual war. This is what a perpetual state of war. This is also what American policymakers, will come back to this, call the forever war that the US has been fighting, notably against terror, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11/2001. This perpetual state of war, ladies and gentlemen, means that liberal democracies, Western liberal democracies, at best refute the liberal philosophy, and maybe even liberal democracies betray the liberal philosophy. The liberal philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who's at the origin of the idea according to which democracies, as distinguished from non-democracies, have an inherent tendency to behave peacefully. It's the last point of today's chapter, a kind of philosophical analysis. According to Immanuel Kant, when he wrote his Perpetual Peace sketch in 1795, what was he witnessing? We saw this. He witnessed the wars of the French Revolution, and he came to the conclusion that the state of nature among states was a state of war. But he believed in the possibility of getting out of this state of war. Peace is possible, and even perpetual peace. Perpetual peace is possible if some conditions are met. And he called these conditions definitive articles of the perpetual peace and preliminary articles. We can call them major conditions and secondary conditions. I would like to focus on one major condition and on 4 secondary conditions. In order, according to Immanuel Kant, for perpetual peace to prevail, the first condition that must be met is that states must be republics we could use the term nowadays, democracies. Why? Because in a republican constitution or in a democracy, the consent of the citizens is required when a state considers, when the government considers the possibility of going to war. The government must make sure that the citizens accept, since they are at the origin of the government's legitimacy. And why are then democracies inherently peaceful? Because the negative consequences of wars would be the burden of these negative consequences would have to be supported by the citizens themselves. Look at the quotes, they would have to fight themselves as soldiers, compulsory draft at that time. They would have to supply the costs of war. They would have to repair the devastation, the destructions caused by the war if the war takes place on their territory. They would have to pay the debt in the case of the war finance through borrowing. And these constraints upon a government do not exist in autocratic government, where the ruler can do what he likes to do, because he himself will not have to bear the negative consequences of a war, since the subjects, there are no citizens in an autocratic regime, since the subjects would have to pay in terms of money and in terms of their own life the consequences of the war that such a dictator could resolve for insignificant reasons, the very end of the quote, as if it were but a hunting expedition. So according to Kant, a democratic regime spontaneously, inherently, is favorable to peace, and perpetual peace is likely to prevail if some preliminary conditions are met. First of all, standing armies. I quote 4 out of the 6 ones. I consider these 4 to be still valid nowadays. Standing armies should be abolished. No national debts should be contracted in order to finance the war. A state should not intermeddle or interfere in another state's domestic affairs. And no state should adopt such mode of hostility, that is to say, a kind of warfare, which would make future trust impossible. These are the recommendations of Immanuel Kant. If we look then at what happened to these recommendations in today's Western wars, what do we see? We see that Kant obviously is not listened to by our Western democratic or democratically elected leaders. Standing armies, I start with the preliminary articles, the secondary conditions. Standing armies still exist. There is no more compulsory draft in Western states. The compulsory draft, the national conscription, was abolished in the UK as early as in the 1950s, at the end of the 1950s, in the US after the Vietnam War, in France, Germany, etc., for some 20 years now, in the second half of the 1990s. No more standing armies in the meaning of compulsory army, compulsory draft armies, but armies nowadays are all volunteer forces, sometimes supplemented by corporate warriors, by private military firms, by mercenaries. Western armies resort to mercenaries. And according to Kant, such armies are, of course, the mere fact that they exist tends to convince them that they should resort to violence. No national debts shall be contracted, according to Kant. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, George Bush Jr., the son, George Walker Bush, told the Americans, enjoy life. Go to Disney World in Florida. That's to say, he wanted that his war on terror had no impact upon the American way of life, the American level of life. Very concretely, he decided that the wars that he launched against Afghanistan, a bit later against Iraq, should be financed through borrowing, not through the rise of taxes, because if he had increased the taxes, Americans would no longer enjoy the same way of life. No state shall in the manner preliminary article number 5 by force with the constitution or the government of another state, the non-interference principle, we saw this, it is systematically violated in the name of the right or the duty to interfere to protect human rights. And no state at war with another shall adopt such modes of hostility in order to render mutual trust, mutual confidence impossible in future peace. Well, what happened to Osama bin Laden? He was killed. What happened to Gaddafi? He was killed. What happened to Saddam Hussein? He was hanged after a trial admitted. These methods are unlikely to permit trust to exist in the populations who rightly or wrongly have some sympathy for the dictators concerned. What's worse, Western armies use new technologies to wage their wars. They more and more resort to air power, to distant bombing, to drones, which means that their troops are no longer risking their lives. Which amounts to saying that the contemporary wars fought by Western democracies are unequal wars, no longer wars among equals, but among superior, technologically speaking, and inferior, technologically speaking, belligerents. Terrorists or national officers who are about to be killed by a drone strike do not know that they are about to be killed. They cannot retaliate. They cannot defend themselves. This mode of hostility, this warfare, obviously introduces a very significant hierarchy, which is likely to make future trust impossible. According to Kant, such modes of hostility are characteristic of punitive wars of extermination, of annihilation, just as the ones waged by former Europeans in their colonial conquests. They do deny in our world to our opponents the right of being equals. And in so they somehow end up creating a perpetual state of war, an endless cycle of violence, because our opponents cannot but look for means to retaliate. And the means that they found, I'm afraid, consist in terrorist attacks that take place in our Western societies, as has been the case during the last 5 or 6 years, notably in France. Last but not least, the wars that are fought, and I come back to the first, the major condition of the perpetual peace, according to Kant, the wars that are fought nowadays, since they are fought by professional soldiers and no more by national conscripts, since they are fought overseas and not on our territories, since they are financed no longer by higher taxes, but by debt, these wars, we citizens in our Western states, we are not aware to some extent of their existence. They have no impact upon our everyday life. And this is the reason why we are not opposed to these wars. So the consent of citizens, emphasized by Immanuel Kant, is no longer needed, which amounts to saying that our leaders, though being democratically elected, are no more accountable. They wage wars without having to tell us why they do so. and whether they should go on or not. To put it differently, the contemporary wars of liberal democracies favor, in the US, the so-called imperial presidency. And they favor in France the so-called domaine réservé of the French president. Liberal intolerance towards illiberal actors ends up in endless wars favoring undemocratic practices in our democratic liberal Western states. I can't help from thinking that foreign policy, that democracy, substantively defined, stops there where foreign policy starts. And our Western leaders, ladies and gentlemen, are aware of this evolution. Let's listen to Obama, a speech held in 2013 at the National Defense University in Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., May 23, 2013. He makes an allusion to the authorization to use military force that had been adopted by the US Congress in 2001 after the terrorist attacks, and which is at the origin of American presidents resorting to the war on terror and deciding which precise operations, etc., should be launched. Listen to Obama.
Now, all these issues remind us that the choices we make about war can impact, in sometimes unintended ways, the openness and freedom on which our way of life depends. And that is why I intend to engage Congress about the existing authorization to use military force, or AUMF, to determine how we can continue to fight terrorism without keeping America on a perpetual wartime footing. The AUMF is now nearly 12 years old. The Afghan war is coming to an end. Core al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self. Groups like AQAP must be dealt with, but in the years to come, not every collection of thugs that labels themselves al-Qaeda will pose a credible threat to the United States. Unless we discipline our thinking, our definitions, our actions, we may be drawn into more wars we don't need to fight, or continue to grant presidents unbound powers more suited for traditional armed conflicts between nation states. So I look forward to engaging Congress and the American people in efforts to refine and ultimately repeal the AUMF's mandate. And I will not sign laws designed to expand this mandate further. Our systematic effort to dismantle terrorist organizations must continue. But this war, like all wars, must end. That's what history advises. That's what our democracy demands.
One year after this speech, in 2014, what did Obama do? He decided America should intervene against ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS did not exist, or was not considered to be dangerous in 2013 during this speech. 1 year later, it was an enemy who deserved to be fought, and America launched its Operation Inherent Resolve. Maybe because he had said in 2012, 1 year before the speech of 2013, that, I quote, America remains the indispensable nation in world affairs. And as long as I'm president, I, Obama, I intend to keep it that way. So he decided America should go on fighting wars. And of course, regarding the Afghan war, which he's alluding to too in his speech, he did not respect his promise to put an end to the Afghan war. The Afghan war went on up to 2021. Joe Biden, ladies and gentlemen, decided that America should withdraw. Does this withdrawal mean that the post-Cold War world has reached a turning point because of America changing its policy? This is the question I would like to provide an answer to in my next and last chapter, the conclusive chapter, next week, in other words. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again in a week. Have a great day. Goodbye.